Good evening and welcome back to Half Past History. This is the channel where history is told slowly, slow enough to rest to, slow enough, if you like, to fall asleep to. Tonight we are going to spend the evening with a group of young women who lived almost 200 years ago in a brand new town in Massachusetts beside a wide and busy river. They worked in the largest factory in America. And their story is not the sad one you might expect. It is, in its quiet way, one of the most hopeful stories this country has to tell. But before we begin, let us get you comfortable. Set your screen aside or turn its light down low. You will not need your eyes for this. Let the pillow take the whole weight of your head. If there is a fan turning somewhere or rain at the glass, let those sounds settle in beneath my voice. They are welcome here. There is nothing to hold on to tonight. Nothing to remember, nothing to finish. If you drift off somewhere in the middle, that is not a failure. That is exactly the idea. The looms will keep running without you the way they always did, all through the day and into the evening, whether anyone was watching or not. Take one slow breath in and let it go. Good. Let us begin. Here's a picture that probably comes to mind when you hear the words factory girl. You imagine something grim. A pale child at a machine in a dark and roaring room. Long hours, low pay, a hard master, a stolen youth. You imagine the mills of old England that Charles Dickens wrote about, all soot and misery, and you imagine that the American version must have been the same or worse. And parts of that picture are true. The days were very long. The rooms were hot and loud. The work was hard, and now and then it was dangerous. But tonight I want to set that picture gently aside because it hides something. For a whole generation of young women in America in the 1830s and 40s, going to work in the mills of a town called Lowell was not the beginning of misery. It was the beginning of freedom. It was the first time in their lives, and very nearly the first time in the history of American women, that thousands of them left home together to earn money that was entirely their own. Think about what that meant. These were farmers' daughters, mostly from the quiet hill towns of New England. On the farm, a daughter worked from dawn to dark for no wages at all, because that was simply what a daughter did. Her labor belonged to the family. Her days belonged to her father. And then a new kind of place opened up 100 miles away, and it said something no one had said to these young women before. Come and work, and we will pay you. In money, every week, and the money will be yours. They came by the thousands. And what they found was not only a job, it was a whole world of their own making. A house full of other young women just like them. A parlor for talking and a bell for curfew and a keeper who cooked their meal. Lending libraries and evening lectures. And, most astonishing of all, a magazine. A literary magazine full of poems and stories and essays written entirely by the factory girls themselves that a visiting Charles Dickens read and admired and praised in print. That is the story tonight. Not the grim one. The real one, which is richer and stranger and a great deal more moving. The story of the Lowell Mill girls and the brief, bright chapter when a New England factory town became, without quite meaning to, the birthplace of the independent American working woman. Here is the road ahead of us tonight. We will begin with the town itself and the quiet, calculating men who built it from nothing on purpose as a kind of experiment. Then we will meet the girls and learn where they came from and why they left home. We will arrive with a new girl on her first frightening evening and move into the boarding house and meet the other girls and the widow who kept them. We will rise at 5 in the morning to the sound of the bell and go into the mill and learn what the work actually was. We will count up the wages and see what a young woman could do with money of her own for the first time. We will spend an evening the way they spent theirs, among books and lectures and letters home. We will read the magazine they wrote. We will stand with them on the day they walked out of the mills together and startled the whole nation. We will pass through a year of seasons with them and then watch gently as their brief, remarkable era comes to its close. And near the end, if you are still awake, there are two quiet gifts waiting. One is the sound of these women's own voices in the words they left behind. The other is a place still standing where you can hear their looms turning to this very day. If these slow journeys into the past bring you any peace, alike helps other tired minds find this quiet harbor, and subscribing means you will never miss an evening. And if you feel like it, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you are tonight and what the hour is where you are. I read them in the mornings, and it is a comfort to see how many of you drifted off together. But there is no hurry about any of that. There was never much hurry in a place like this once the working day was done. So settle deeper into the pillow now. It is the 1830s. Somewhere in the hills of New England, a young woman is packing a small trunk and looking down a road she has never traveled toward a town she has only heard about. Let us go and see where that road leads. Most towns are not planned. They happen. A crossroads, a mill by a stream, a church, a tavern, and slowly a town gathers itself out of the accidents of geography and habit. Lowell was different. Lowell was drawn on paper before it existed. It was designed the way you might design a machine to do one thing supremely well, and the thing was this: to turn raw cotton into finished cloth under one roof on a scale the young United States had never seen. The idea began with a man named Francis Cabot Lowell, a Boston merchant with a careful mind and a quiet, almost secretive determination. In the years before this story, he had traveled to England and Scotland, where the great cotton mills of the age already roared along the rivers. The British guarded the secrets of those mills jealous. You could not buy the plans for a power loom, and you certainly could not carry one out of the country. So Francis Cabot Lowell did the only thing left to him. He walked through those mills as a polite and admiring visitor, and he watched and he remembered. And he carried the machines home in his head. Back in Massachusetts, working with a gifted mechanic named Paul Moody, he built a power loom of his own and set up a mill on the Charles River at a place called Waltham. It was the first factory in America where every step of making cloth, from the raw cotton bale to the finished bolt, happened in the same building, driven by falling water. It worked. It made money. But the little Charles River could only turn so many wheels, and the men behind the venture, a group of wealthy Boston families history remembers simply as the Boston Associates, wanted more, much more. Francis Cabot Lowell himself did not live to see what came next. He died young in 1817. But his partners took his name and his idea north to a spot where a much larger river, the Merrimack, dropped over a series of falls with enormous power, and there they built their new town from the ground up. They named it, in his memory, Lowell. It grew at a speed that astonished everyone. Where there had been a quiet farming village and a few scattered houses, there rose within a single generation one of the largest manufacturing cities in America. By the 1840s, Lowell held something like 10 great textile corporations, a dozen and more huge mills, and a population that had swelled past 20,000 people, most of whom had arrived only recently, drawn by the roar of the looms. It earned a nickname that stuck: the Spindle City. Rivers of water were bent to the task, diverted from the Merrimack into a network of canals that ran through the town like veins, each one dropping water onto the wheels of a mill and driving through a forest of shafts and belts, the thousands upon thousands of spindles and looms. And there was one more thing about the population of Lowell that no visitor failed to notice, because there had never been an American city quite like it. It was overwhelmingly a city of young women. In a town of some 20,000 souls, the women outnumbered the men very nearly 2 to 1. Walk the streets of Lowell in 1840, and you walked among crowds of young women, going to work, coming from work, shopping, strolling, talking. It was in a country where a woman's place was assumed to be a farmhouse kitchen under a father's or a husband's roof, a genuinely strange and new kind of place. A city largely run by the daily labor of the daughters of New England. And here's the part that makes Lowell more than just a factory. The men who built it were haunted by what they had seen in England. There, the mill towns were places of terrible poverty, dark and diseased, where the word factory had become another word for human ruin. The Boston associates did not want that. Partly out of genuine conscience, and partly because a wholesome reputation was good for business, they set out to build a different kind of mill town. A clean one, an orderly one, a moral one. A place, they promised, where a respectable young woman could come and work for a few years and go home better off and no worse in character. They called it, without much modesty, a model city. And to make the promise real, they needed a very particular kind of worker. They needed the daughters of New England. Look out over the region in those years and you would see thousands of small hill farms, hard-working, land-rich, and cash-poor, each one full of children. On such a farm, sons were needed for the heavy work and would one day inherit the land. But daughters were, in the cold arithmetic of the time, a kind of surplus. Loved, certainly. Worked hard, always. But not paid, and not, in most cases, destined for anything but marriage to a neighboring farmer and the same life their mothers had led. These young women could read and write. New England had seen to that, with its village schools and its deep old belief that everyone ought to know their letters. They were capable, sensible, and many of them quietly restless. They had grown up hearing that the world was wide and that they would probably never see much of it. And then the mill agents came through the hill towns in their wagons, offering something that had simply never been offered to a farmer's daughter before. Come to Lowell. Live in a proper boarding house, chaperoned and respectable, so your parents need not worry. Work in the mills. And be paid in cash every single week. The recruiting itself became a small industry. Agents traveled the back roads of New Hampshire and Vermont and Maine and the Massachusetts hills in wagons going farm to farm, carrying the news of Lowell into valleys where it had never been heard, and sometimes carrying the girls themselves back down, a wagon load at a time, to the mills. The word spread on its own, too, faster than any agent, because a girl who had gone to Lowell and come home for a visit in fine clothes with money in her purse and stories on her lips was the best advertisement the mills could ever have. Younger sisters and cousins and neighbors saw her and made up their minds. And so the tide built, until by the 1840s something like 10,000 young women had come down out of rural New England to pass through the mills of this one city, the largest gathering of independent working women the country and perhaps the world had ever seen. For a great many of them, it was the first real choice of their lives. Some came for adventure, plainly to see a town and meet strangers and escape the endless sameness of the farm. Some came out of need, to send money home when the crops failed or a father fell ill. Some came with a private and specific dream, to earn enough to buy books or fine clothes or a little independence or to pay for a brother's schooling, since a son could go to college and a daughter in those days could not. And some came quietly, simply to have for the first time a little money that belonged to no one but themselves. They were young. Most were between 15 and 25, though some were far younger. A girl named Lucy Larcom went to work in the Lowell mills at 11 years old as a doffer, one of the small children whose job was to swap out the full bobbins of thread. Another, named Harriet Hanson, started at 10. Both of them would work there for more than a decade, and both, remarkably, would grow up to be writers, and would leave us memoirs of these years so warm and clear that we can almost walk beside them. So picture the young woman from The Hook, the one packing her small trunk in a farmhouse bedroom. She is perhaps 17. She has never slept a night away from her family. She is frightened, and she is trying not to show it, and underneath the fear there is something she can hardly name, something bright and forward-leaning. It is the feeling of a door opening. Tomorrow she takes the stage for Lowell. Let us go with her. The journey to Lowell took most of a day or more, jolting along in a crowded stagecoach over rough roads, the hills of home falling away behind and the country slowly changing. And then the town appeared, and it was like nothing our young woman had ever seen. She had grown up where the loudest sound was a church bell or a barking dog, where the horizon was trees and sky. Now here was a place of brick, great blocks of it, 4 and 5 stories tall, running in long straight rows beside the river, larger than any building she had ever imagined, their hundreds of windows catching the afternoon light. She could hear the town before the coach even stopped, a deep, steady, oceanic roar she could not place, the sound of thousands of machines turning at once, felt in the chest as much as heard. Canals threaded between the mills, carrying the river's power from wheel to wheel. And everywhere, there were young women. On the streets, in the doorways, crossing the bridges in 2s and 3s, more young women in one place than she had seen in her whole life. It was overwhelming, and it was thrilling, and by the time she had found the boarding house to which she had been assigned, and climbed the steps with her small trunk, she was probably close to tears, in the way that you can be close to tears from sheer bigness and strangeness and the long road behind you. The door opened. A woman stood there, middle-aged, aproned, sharp-eyed but not unkind, the keeper of the house. She looked the new girl over, took in the country clothes and the frightened face, and she had seen 100 girls arrive exactly like this one, and she said something ordinary and welcoming and drew her inside, out of the noise, into the warm smell of supper cooking. And just like that, the hardest part was over. She was here. The boarding house was the other half of the Lowell experiment, and in many ways it was the more important half. The mill owners understood something shrewd. No New England farmer was going to send his teenage daughter alone to a distant industrial city to live as she pleased. The very idea would have been scandalous. So the company built rows of boarding houses beside the mills, owned them, and set the rules, and this respectability was the price of getting the workers at all. Each house was run by a keeper, very often a widow, a woman of good character whose job was to feed the girls, keep the place clean and orderly, and crucially to watch over their conduct and reassure the world that nothing improper was going on. The keeper's own life, it is worth pausing to say, was no easy one. She was very often a widow, a woman who had lost her husband and her income and her place in the ordinary order of things, and for whom running a company boarding house was a respectable way to survive. She rose before the girls and went to bed after them. She cooked 3 meals a day for 30 or 40 hungry young women on a wood stove in the narrow time the bells allowed, and she kept the house clean, and she kept the accounts, and she kept, above all, the peace and the propriety, for it was her name and her livelihood on the line if her house got a bad reputation. Many of the girls remembered their keeper with real affection, a second mother far from home. Some remembered a stricter one. But the keeper was the quiet hinge on which the whole respectable machine turned, and she is too easily forgotten. A house held perhaps 20 to 40 young women. Downstairs there was a kitchen where the keeper worked her long day, a dining room with a great table, and a parlor where the girls gathered in the evenings. Upstairs were the bedrooms, small and plain, and there was no privacy to speak of. Girls shared rooms and shared beds, 2 or 3 or even 4 to a bed, sleeping crosswise sometimes to fit. To a modern ear, that sounds like hardship. To a farm girl who had grown up sharing a bed with her sisters, it was simply normal, and the closeness of it, far from being a burden, became the very best thing about the whole life. Because this was the secret at the heart of Lowell. Put 20 young women of the same age under one roof, all far from home, all working the same hours, all discovering the same freedoms and homesicknesses at the same time, and you do not get 20 lonely workers. You get a sisterhood. They were, remember, mostly strangers to one another at first, come from scattered hill towns that had never heard of each other. But they were bound together fast by the sheer intensity of the shared life. They ate every meal together at the long table, the keeper's plain good cooking, brown bread and beans and pie, hurried down in the short breaks the bells allowed. They dressed together and undressed together and did each other's hair. The older girls took the frightened new ones under their wing, showed them the mill, lent them a shawl, told them which overseer was decent and which was to be endured. They nursed each other through fevers and heartbreaks and the crushing early weeks of homesickness. They sat up in the parlor in the evenings and talked endlessly, the way you can only talk when you are young and surrounded by others exactly as young as you. There were rules, of course, and the girls felt them. a curfew, usually 10 o'clock, after which the door was locked, an expectation of church on Sundays, a code of proper behavior, and a keeper watching to enforce it, and the ever-present knowledge that a serious disgrace could get you sent home. It was a chaperoned freedom, a freedom with a fence around it. But here's the thing that is easy to miss from our side of history. Compared to the farm, compared to a father's roof and a father's word as law, even a fence freedom was a wider sky than any of these young women had ever stood beneath. Inside that fence, they had their own money, their own friends, their own evenings, and each other. For a new girl, lying awake that first night, wedged in a strange bed between two sleeping strangers who by month's end would be closer than sisters, listening to the great mills still murmuring in the dark across the way, it must have seemed impossibly far from the farm. And it was. That was the whole point. She had come to the edge of a new kind of life, and in the morning when the bell rang she would step into it. Life in Lowell was ruled by bells, not the gentle church bell of the home village, marking Sundays and funerals, but the great insistent mill bells that divided every working day into pieces and told thousands of people all at once exactly what to do and when. The first bell came at around 5 o'clock in the morning, in the dark for much of the year. It was the rising bell, and it pulled the whole house awake, the girls dressing quickly in the cold, splashing water on their faces, the keeper already downstairs at the stove. There was a bell for breakfast, though in the earliest years breakfast was often eaten after the first stretch of work rather than before, in the gray beginning of the day. And then at around 7, the last bell, the one that called him in, and the streets filled with a river of young women all flowing the same way toward the mill gates, and the gates closed behind them, and the working day began. There was a bell at midday, too, and it set off one of the strangest daily sights in Lowell. The girls were given only a short break for their dinner, the main meal taken at noon, perhaps half an hour, sometimes less. And the boarding houses stood a little way from the mills. So when the dinner bell rang, the mill gates opened and the streets of Lowell filled all at once with hundreds and hundreds of young women running home to the boarding house, bolting down a hot dinner the keeper had timed to the minute, and running back, all inside half an hour, so that the streets emptied and filled and emptied again twice over in the space of a single break, like a tide going out and rushing back. Visitors watched it in amazement. The girls thought nothing of it. It was simply Tuesday. Inside, the mill was a world of its own. Let us walk up through it, floor by floor, the way the cotton itself traveled. On the lower floors, the raw cotton was cleaned and carded, combed out into soft ropes of fiber. Higher up, in the spinning rooms, those ropes were drawn and twisted into thread on frames that hummed and clattered in long rows. And here worked the youngest children, the doffers, whose whole job was to dart in when a set of bobbins was full, pull them off, slip empty ones on, and dart out again, a task of a few busy minutes, followed by a stretch of waiting, over and over, all day. And on the upper floors were the weaving rooms, the loudest place of all, where the power looms stood rank on rank, throwing their shuttles back and forth faster than the eye could follow, turning thread into cloth with a noise like a great mechanical rainstorm that never once let up. The weaving room deserves a moment of its own, because it was the heart of the mill and the hardest place to describe to anyone who has never stood in one. Imagine a single long room, high and bright with rows of tall windows, and filling it in ranks like soldiers 100 or more power looms, each one a heavy iron frame of moving parts. And imagine every one of them running at once. The shuttle, the little wooden boat that carries the crosswise thread, is thrown across each loom and snapped back again 200 times a minute, faster than you can watch, by the force of the falling river outside translated through shafts and leather belts overhead. The sound is not a clatter. It is a roar, a solid wall of noise, 100 hammering rhythms beating slightly out of step until they blur into one enormous mechanical thunder that fills your whole body and does not stop hour after hour all day. A weaver tended several of these looms at once, walking the aisle between them, watching for a broken thread, mending it with quick fingers, keeping the shuttles flying. It took nerve and skill and a kind of physical courage simply to work in that room, and the young women did it and got so used to it that they could carry on a whole conversation across two roaring looms by watching each other's lips. The Doffers had a different day, the small children, some as young as 8 or 9, who worked the spinning frames. Their job came in bursts. A set of bobbins would fill with fresh spun thread, and the doffer would swoop in, strip the full bobbins off, snap empty ones on, and then have a stretch of nothing much to do until the next set filled, perhaps 15 minutes on, 45 minutes free. So the youngest workers in the mill had, oddly, the most idle time, and they spent it as children do, slipping outside to sit in the sun, or playing games in the mill yard, or curling up in a corner with a book. Lucy Larcom, who was one of them, remembered those in-between hours almost fondly. A strange childhood spent partly at a machine and partly at play in the great humming building by the river. It was hard, and we should be honest about the hardness. The days were long, 12 to 14 hours of them, and the work stood you on your feet the whole time. The air was deliberately kept hot and damp because dry air made the thread brittle and snapped it, so the rooms were close and thick and full of floating cotton lint that the girls breathed all day. The machines were powerful and unguarded, and now and then they caught a sleeve or a loose lock of hair, and there were injuries, and worse. No one who worked in those rooms would have called it easy. And yet, talk to the mill girls themselves in the memoirs they left, and what comes through is not mainly complaint. It is a kind of matter-of-fact pride and a great deal of ordinary human life carrying on inside the roar. The looms were loud, but the girls learned to read each other's lips and shout in each other's ears and gossip right through the din. Younger doffers, with their minutes of work and their minutes of waiting, would slip outside to sit in the sun or play or read. And most wonderfully, the girls pinned things up to read while they worked. Poems and hymns and scraps of the Bible tacked to the frames and the window posts so that a young woman minding a spinning frame might be quietly memorizing a poem line by line through a whole long thundering afternoon. They were factory hands, yes, but a great many of them kept a corner of their minds entirely their own and furnished it with poetry. And at the end of the week came the thing that made all of it worthwhile, the thing that had drawn them down from the hills in the first place. The pay. A mill girl earned somewhere around $3 to $4 a week. Out of that, the cost of her board, her room, and all her meals was taken, and that came to perhaps $1.25, sometimes less, which left her every single week with a couple of dollars that were hers, simply completely hers. It is very hard from here to feel how enormous that was. We are used to being paid. They were not. remember where these young women had come from. On the farm, a daughter's work earned her keep and a father's approval, and nothing she could hold in her hand. Now, for the first time in the history of most of their families, a woman was handed money that no one could tell her how to spend. And what did they do with it? Everything. They saved it, a great deal of it, tucking it away week by week into accounts of their own, and the mill girls of Lowell became quietly some of the first American women to have savings in their own names. They spent it, too, with the giddy pleasure of people spending their own earnings for the first time on good dresses and ribbons and shoes, so that a Lowell mill girl on a Sunday, dressed in clothes she had bought herself, was famously better turned out than many a fine lady, and knew it. They bought books, stacks of them. They paid for lessons, and a striking number of them sent the money home faithfully month after month to lift a mortgage off the family farm, or to keep a younger sister in school, or again and again in the records to pay a brother's way through college, a brother who could go where they could not, on wages they had earned at the loom. Think about that for a moment as you lie there. A young woman standing at a spinning frame in a hot and roaring room, 12 hours a day, so that her brother 100 miles away could sit in a quiet lecture hall and become a minister or a lawyer. She did it without bitterness, mostly, and with pride, because it was her money and her choice, and the freedom to make that choice was itself the prize. That was the deal Lowell offered. Long, hard days, and in exchange, a thing almost no woman of their world had ever held, wages of their own. And what they built with those wages in the few short hours the bells left them each evening is the most surprising part of the whole story. Let us go and see how a mill girl spent her evening. The bell that let them out came in the evening at around 7:30, and by then the light was going and the girls were tired to the bone. You might expect that they simply ate their supper and fell into bed. Some evenings surely they did, but not most evenings, because between the closing bell and the 10 o'clock curfew there lay a few hours that were, for the first time in these young women's lives, entirely their own. No father to answer to, no chores waiting in the barn, no one to say how the time should be spent. A few hours of freedom every single day, and the Lowell mill girls used them in a way that astonished everyone who came to look. They read. My goodness, they read. Lowell had lending libraries, and the girls emptied their shelves and passed books hand to hand along the boarding house table and argued about them in the parlor at night. Reading was so beloved and so constant that the mills eventually had to make rules against bringing books onto the factory floor, which tells you everything about how much these young women wanted to read, that a company had to forbid it. They went to lectures. Lowell had a lyceum, a hall built for public talks, and it ran a full season of them through the winter, and the great thinkers and speakers of the age came through on the lecture circuit to fill it. And the benches filled up night after night, not with idle gentry, but with tired factory girls who had been on their feet since 5 in the morning, and who chose, with their precious free hours, to sit in a hall and listen to a lecture on astronomy or history or literature or the great moral questions of the day. Think of the hunger in that. To work 14 hours and then, instead of sleeping, to walk to a lecture hall to feed your mind. The speakers were often startled by their audience. They had expected, perhaps, to talk down to simple mill hands, and instead they found rows of sharp, attentive, well-read young women who had done the reading and would have opinions afterward. They formed what they called improvement circles, small groups that met in the evenings to read their own writing aloud to one another and offer gentle, serious criticism, a kind of homemade writing school built entirely by the students themselves. They studied languages, teaching each other, or clubbing together to hire a tutor. They took lessons in music and in drawing. They saved, some of them, toward more schooling later, and a great many Lowell girls went on to become teachers, carrying their painfully won learning out into the one-room schoolhouses of a growing country. They went to church on Sundays and to concerts and on long walks out along the river and into the countryside in the summer evenings, arm in arm, talking about everything under the sky. It was by any measure an extraordinary thing. Here was a class of people the world expected nothing from, young female working with their hands for wages, and instead of sinking into the dullness that everyone predicted for factory workers, they reached upward hungrily with both hands for books and ideas and self-improvement. Visitors came from Europe expecting to pity them and left half in disbelief. The mill girls of Lowell were quite possibly the best read body of working people anywhere in the world. And then they did the thing that sealed their fame. They started writing. It began in the improvement circles and the church groups, young women reading their poems and stories aloud to each other, and someone had the bold idea that these ought to be printed. And so, beginning in the year 1840, there appeared a small magazine with a modest name, the Lowell Offering, a monthly collection of poems, stories, sketches, and essays, and every word of it written by young women actively working in the mills. Sit with how strange and wonderful that is. In an age when respectable women rarely published anything at all, and when factory workers were assumed to have nothing in their heads worth reading, a group of teenage and 20-something factory girls in a Massachusetts mill town were writing and publishing their own literary magazine on the strength of the few tired evening hours the bells allowed them. They wrote gentle sketches of home and nature. They wrote fiction, some of it sentimental, some of it sharp. They wrote about their own lives, about homesickness and friendship and the great looms, and yes, sometimes carefully about the heat and the noise and the wages and the speed of the machine. The Offering became famous. It was reprinted and passed around and talked about far beyond Lowell, held up all over the world as proof of what the common people, and common women especially, were capable of when given half a chance. And here is my favorite part, and the reason we spoke of Charles Dickens at the very start of tonight. In 1842, that same Charles Dickens, the most celebrated writer in the English-speaking world, the great chronicler of the miseries of the English factory, came to America and made a point of visiting Lowell, half expecting, one suspects, to find the same horrors he knew from home. He did not find them. He was deeply impressed by the town, by the cleanliness of it, and the health and dignity of the workers. And when he was handed a bound volume of the Lowell Offering, 400 pages of writing by factory girls, he sat and read it, and he wrote afterward that it, in his words, will compare advantageously with a great many English annuals, meaning that these young women, minding looms 12 hours a day, wrote as well as the polished professional writers of London. Coming from Dickens, there was no higher praise. And the young women of Lowell had earned it in the stolen hours after the closing bell by lamplight when they might so easily have simply gone to sleep. Rest on that a moment as the evening deepens. A hot, loud room by day, and by night a magazine that made Charles Dickens take off his hat. That was the Mill Girl. Both of those things at once in the same tired, remarkable person. Now, the young women who read Dickens and wrote poetry and saved their wages were not, it turned out, the meek and grateful workers the mill owners had imagined. They had minds of their own, and they had learned their own worth, and when they felt that worth was being cheated, they did something that shocked the country. They walked out. It happened more than once. The first great turnout came when the mills, facing hard times, announced that they would cut the girls' wages. The girls refused. They called it a turnout, which was their word for a strike, and it was a startling sight. Hundreds of young women, in some accounts well over 1,000, simply stopped work and walked out of the mills together and into the streets, and the great looms fell silent. A couple of years later, they did it again, and this time the spark was even more revealing. The companies announced that they would raise the rent on the boarding houses, which amounted to another cut in what the girls could keep, and the young women who by now understood exactly how the arithmetic worked turned out once more in even greater numbers, thousands of them this time, and stayed out for weeks, long enough to hurt the mills badly. What is striking is not only the courage of it, but the sophistication. These were supposedly simple farm girls, and yet they grasped at once that a rent increase was a wage cut wearing a different coat, and they organized against it with petitions and processions and a solidarity that held for weeks. They had learned to read the ledger as well as the poem. There is a wonderful moment recorded from one of these turnouts. In a room where the older workers were hesitating, afraid to be the first to leave, it was a girl of only about 11, a daughter named Harriet Hanson, the same Harriet who would grow up to write her memoirs, who led the way. She stood up and said she was going out, whether anyone followed or not, and she walked, and the others, shamed and inspired by a child's courage, walked after her. She remembered it all her life as one of her proudest moments. The turnouts did not always win. The companies were powerful, and the girls in the end needed the work. But something important had happened all the same. These young women had discovered that together they had power, that a mill could not run without them, and that they were not obliged to accept whatever they were handed. And a decade later, that discovery flowered into something larger. In the 1840s, led by a mill worker named Sarah Bagley, the women of Lowell organized to demand a shorter working day, the 10-hour day, in place of the 12 and 14 they endured. They formed the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association, one of the very first organizations of working women anywhere in the United States. They gathered thousands of signatures. They petitioned the Massachusetts legislature, and when the legislature sent men to investigate, Sarah Bagley and her fellow workers testified before them, factory women standing up in a government hall to speak for themselves and their sisters. They did not win the 10-hour day, not then. But they had done something no group of American working women had ever done before. They had organized and spoken and demanded in public in their own voices. We should hold this beside the grim old picture of the helpless factory girl and let it correct that picture for good. The Lowell Mill girls were not victims waiting to be pitied. They were among the first American women to stand up together and insist on being treated fairly. The long history of working people organizing for their rights in this country has one of its true beginnings here in a New England mill town led by young women in calico dresses who had taught themselves in the evenings exactly what they were worth. Let a whole year turn now, slowly, while you rest, and let us feel the seasons of this life the way the girls felt them. And let the year begin, as the mill girl's own story so often began, with homesickness. The first weeks were the hardest of the whole life for most of them. A girl who had never in her life been more than a few miles from her mother's kitchen now lay awake in a strange bed in a strange loud city, and the ache of it was real and sharp, and many a new girl cried herself to sleep those first nights, quietly, so the others would not hear. But the others always heard, because they had all done exactly the same, and so the older girls were gentle with the new ones, and drew them into the talk and the walks and the shared work. And within a few weeks the homesickness softened, and the boarding house itself became a kind of home, and the other girls a kind of family, and the ache turned, almost without the girl noticing, into belonging. In winter the rising bell came in pure darkness, and the walk to the mill was cold and black, the girls hurrying in shawls through streets lit only by the mill's own lamps, their breath white in the air, the river hard with ice. Those were the hard mornings, rising in the dark to work in the dark. But the mill itself was warm, almost too warm, and the boarding house at night was warmer still, full of lamplight and voices and the smell of the keeper's supper, and there was a deep coziness in coming in from the black cold to all that light and company. In spring the light came back, and the walk to work happened in the fresh early morning, and the girls could go walking by the river again in the long evenings, and everything felt lighter. In summer the mills grew brutally hot, the worst season on the factory floor, but the evenings were golden and long, and there were excursions and picnics and the simple pleasure of warm air after the day's work. And in autumn the country girls felt the old pull of home most strongly. Harvest time, the season when the farm needed hands and when a girl's family gathered, and many of them saved their visits home for the fall, taking the stage back up into the hills to see the farm again and be, for a week or two, somebody's daughter instead of somebody's operative. Those visits home were their own kind of story. A girl would arrive back in the village transformed, in city clothes she had bought with her own money, carrying books and gifts and news of a wider world, a little more confident, a little more her own person than the girl who had left. The neighbors would look, and some would disapprove, and the younger sisters would gaze at her as at a being from another planet, and quietly resolve that they too would go to Lowell as soon as they were old enough. And that was how it went, year upon year, a great tide of young women flowing down from the hills to the mills and back again, each one staying a few years, most of them leaving in the end to marry or to teach, making room for the next. A whole generation passed through Lowell this way. For each of them it was a chapter, not a life sentence, a few bright crowded years of work and friendship and independence, and then away into the rest of their lives carrying what they had learned there. But even as this life went on, quietly, the ground was shifting beneath it. The world that had made Lowell possible was already beginning to change. The Lowell of the mill girls, the model city with its libraries and its magazine and its respectable boarding houses, was a beautiful experiment. But it rested on a bargain that could not last, and by the middle of the 1840s the bargain was quietly coming undone. The trouble, from the owner's point of view, was that the whole arrangement was expensive. Decent wages, clean boarding houses, keepers to run them, the whole apparatus of respectability that had been needed to coax farmers' daughters down from the hills, all of it cost money. And as the mills grew and competition sharpened, the pressure to cut those costs grew with them. The owners began to ask more of the workers, more looms tended by each girl, faster machines, the the speed-ups that the mill girls wrote about with such quiet anger in the offering. The work got harder, and the old sense that Lowell was a fair and even generous place began to wear thin. And then history sent a great wave that changed everything. Across the ocean in Ireland, the potato crop failed and failed again, and a famine of terrible proportions drove hundreds of thousands of desperate people out of the country and across the Atlantic. Many of them landed in New England, poor, hungry, and willing to take any work at any wage. Lowell, which had been built on the labor of native-born farm daughters, now found at its gates a new population that would work for less and could not, in their need, afford to be choosy about hours or conditions. The mill owners, under their competitive pressures, made the choice you would expect. Slowly through the 1840s and 50s, they filled the mills with immigrant workers who accepted lower pay, and the careful, expensive world of the Yankee mill girl was allowed to fade. Why maintain costly, respectable boarding houses and pay good wages to attract farmers' daughters when there were now workers at the door who would come without any of that? So the farm girls drifted away. The wages fell and the work sped up, and the special character of the place dissolved, and the daughters of New England, who had never truly needed the mills, who had come by choice and could leave by choice, simply stopped coming. And here is a thing worth resting on, because it is where the real meaning of Lowell hides. Those young women did not vanish when they left the mills. They scattered in their thousands out across the whole growing country, and they carried Lowell with them. A great many became school teachers, more than from almost any other single source, so that the reading and the discipline and the quiet confidence learned in a Lowell boarding house went out into 1,000 one-room schoolhouses on the frontier and shaped the next generation of American children. Others became wives and mothers who had, unlike their own mothers, once been out in the world and earned and saved and thought for themselves, and who raised their daughters accordingly. And a striking number of them became reformers, carrying the lesson of the turnouts, the lesson that women together had a voice, into the great movements of the century. Follow just the two girls we have kept our eye on. Lucy Larcom, the 11-year-old Doffer, became a beloved teacher and then a published poet, and wrote the tender memoir of her mill years that lets us walk beside her still. And little Harriet Hanson, who at 11 led her room out on strike, grew up to be Harriet Robinson, a writer, and then something more, an active campaigner for the right of women to vote, carrying the spark of the Lowell turnouts all the way into the long fight for the ballot. The mill girl became the suffragist. The line runs straight from the factory floor to the voting booth through the life of one woman, and she is only one of thousands. The offering ceased publication. The boarding houses filled with different faces. And Lowell went on, still a mighty industrial city, still full of looms and workers, but an ordinary one now, its brief, strange golden age already passing into memory, remembered when it was remembered at all, as a thing that could only have happened once, in one place for one short while. And so we come gently to the end of our evening with the mill girls. We began by setting aside a grim old picture, the pale, unhappy factory child, and I hope by now that picture is gone for good, replaced by something truer and far more moving. We met a town built on purpose beside a great river and the quiet, ambitious men who built it. We met the farmers' daughters who came down from the New England hills, not into slavery, but into the first freedom of their lives. We arrived with a frightened girl on her first evening and watched her find, in a crowded boarding house, a sisterhood closer than blood. We rose to the bells and worked the long hot days, and we counted up the wages that were at last her own. We spent the precious evenings among books and lectures, and we read the astonishing magazine these young women wrote by lamplight that made Charles Dickens tip his hat. We stood with them in the street on the day they walked out of the mills together, and heard the first clear voice of American working women demanding to be treated fairly. And then we watched the whole bright chapter draw quietly to its close as a changing world moved on. It lasted only a generation, this world, a few decades, no more. And then it was gone, so completely that most people today have never heard of it. But while it lasted, it did something that could not be undone. It showed a whole country, and more importantly, it showed the young women themselves that a woman could leave home and earn her own money and live among friends of her own choosing and read and write and think and organize and stand up in a public hall and speak. It planted an idea. And ideas, once planted in enough minds, do not die when the mills fall quiet. Those thousands of mill girls scattered out across the country into marriages and schoolhouses and reform movements and the slow, long fight for women's rights. And they carried the idea with them and handed it forward, and it is still traveling. So rest now. Somewhere it is always a summer evening in the 1840s, and the closing bell has just rung, and a crowd of young women is pouring out of the mill into the golden light, tired and laughing, free until the curfew, their own money in their pockets, and their own thoughts in their heads, walking arm in arm along the river toward home. There is room among them for you. And there is nothing you need to do tonight but drift along with them into the evening. From all of us here at Half Past History, thank you for spending this evening with the mill girls. Sleep well. And yet, if you are still here with me, still just this side of sleep, stay a moment longer. Because a story like this one leaves two small things behind, and I would like to give them to you before the light goes out entirely. One is the sound of these women's own voices. The other is a place where you can still find them. Neither will keep you awake. Both are best heard with your eyes already closed. The first gift is their own voices, because we are lucky enough to have them. Two of the mill girls we met tonight grew up to be writers and left us memoirs of these years so warm and unhurried that reading them is like sitting beside an old woman by a fire while she remembers her girlhood. Lucy Larcom, who went into the mills at 11, wrote a book late in her life called A New England Girlhood, looking back across all the years at the child she had been, the small doffer swapping bobbins, dreaming at the window. And Harriet Hanson, the little girl who led her room out on strike, grew into Harriet Robinson and wrote a book she called Loom and Spindle, remembering the early mill girls with fierce affection and pride. What comes through their pages more than anything is not the hardship. It is the wonder. They write about the friends they made as if those friendships were the great treasure of their lives, which perhaps they were. They write about the first books they read and the first lectures they heard as about doors swinging open in their minds. They write about the mill itself, the noise and the heat and the endless bobbins, with a strange tenderness, the way you remember a hard place where you were nonetheless young and alive and becoming yourself. Larcom remembered the scraps of poetry pinned to her spinning frame, learned by heart through the long afternoons. Robinson remembered the sheer thrill of holding her own wages for the first time. There is a particular quality to the way they remember worth naming, because it is the quality of this whole story. They do not remember themselves as poor girls who were exploited, though by the hard measures of labor they were often underpaid and overworked. And they do not remember themselves as fine ladies who rose above their station. They remember themselves as workers, plainly and proudly, young women who did real hard work with their hands and were paid for it, and who found in the doing of it their own dignity and their own minds and each other. Larcom writes of the mill not as a prison she escaped, but as a place that made her, that gave a poor country child her first books and her first wages and her first sense that her own thoughts might matter. That is a rare note in the whole long history of factory labor, and it belongs to Lowell and to this brief window and to these particular young women, and we should not let it be flattened back into the grim old picture because they themselves would not recognize it there. They knew, these old women writing by their firesides, that they had lived through something that would not come again, and that history was already forgetting it. And so they wrote it down carefully so that we would know, so that on a quiet night, a very long time later, someone drifting off to sleep might hear, faintly across all those years, the voices of the mill girls saying, "We were here, and it was hard, and it was wonderful, and we would not have missed it." And the second gift is that you can still go and stand where they stood. Most of the vanished worlds we visit on this channel are truly gone, left only in words and imagination. But not this one. The city of Lowell is still there on the Merrimack River in Massachusetts, and a good part of the old mill district has been preserved, cared for now as a national park, so that the mill girls' world did not disappear after all. You can walk the canals that carried the river's power from mill to mill. You can step inside a restored boarding house and see the parlor where the girls gathered and the plain small rooms where they slept crowded together. You can hold a copy of the Lowell Offering, and in one of the old mills, in a great room full of restored power looms, they turn the machines on. For a few minutes, visitors stand in a working weave room and hear it, the real thing, that vast mechanical roar the mill girls lived inside for 12 hours a day, so loud you feel it in your body, so loud you finally understand why they learned to read lips and shout in each other's ears. And then someone throws the switch, and the looms wind down, and the enormous noise drains away into silence. And in that sudden quiet, you can almost feel them there. The young women in their calico dresses, tired and proud, pouring out through the gates into the evening light, going home to their books and their friends and their own hard-earned dreams. They were real. They stood in that room, and the room is still there, waiting if you ever wish to go and listen. But you do not need to go anywhere tonight. Tonight you only need to rest. Let the looms wind down. Let the great noise drain away into quiet. Let the crowd of young women fade softly into the golden evening, walking arm in arm along the river until they are only a warm feeling at the edge of sleep, and then not even that. You do not need to remember any of it. The names will keep. Lucy and Harriet and Sarah and all the thousands of others will keep. Somewhere it is always that summer evening in the 1840s, the bell just rung, the light just golden, a whole generation of brave and bookish young women stepping out into the first freedom of their lives, and there is nothing required of you at all except to let go and drift and sleep. Thank you for spending this evening with me here at Half Past History. If you drifted off somewhere back among the looms, then it worked, and I am glad, and I will be here again with another slow journey whenever you are ready for one. And if you are somehow still awake, then simply close your eyes now and let the evening carry you the rest of the way down. Good night. Sleep well. The looms are quiet now, the lamps are lit, and morning is a long and gentle way off yet.